He just wanted peace after retirement. A quiet house by the lake, his loyal dog by his side. Nothing more. But one night, the dog started barking at the walls and led him to a hidden tunnel beneath the floor. What they found inside had been buried for a reason. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. The road that led to Lake Merrill was barely a road at all. What had once been a mining path in the 40s had long ago surrendered to moss, roots, and the slow, patient erosion of rain and wind. Richard Hall's old pickup crawled along the uneven gravel like an exhausted beast, headlights flickering against the wet stone walls of the canyon. He hadn't seen another car in hours, only the sound of tires grinding over stone and the faint metallic rattle of tools in the back reminded him that he still belonged to the human world. When he finally reached the end of the path, the lake appeared suddenly silent, still and black, like a single unblinking eye reflecting the overcast sky. Richard stopped the truck and killed the engine. For a long moment, there was nothing but the slow ticking of cooling metal. His dog, a black German shepherd named Scout, lifted her head from the passenger seat and looked out toward the water. The dog's ears twitched. Richard followed her gaze. Across the lake, half hidden by fog and the gray rock face, stood a house carved directly into the mountain. It looked less like something built and more like something unearthed, a forgotten cave with windows, a relic that had been waiting for him all along. He stepped out, breathing in air that smelled of pine and wet stone. The silence here was not the kind that followed noise, but the kind that had existed before it. Thick, absolute, older than language. The journey had taken him 2 days from Denver. 2 days and 50 years of accumulated noise machines, meetings, hospitals, cities, people. It was strange how easily it all could be left behind. He opened the truck door, whistled for Scout, and the dog jumped down gracefully, landing in the mud with a soft thud. Together, they stood before the house beneath the cliff. Richard unlocked the heavy iron gate at the entrance. The hinges groaned as though waking from a long sleep. The first step inside felt like crossing into a different century. The air was cool and dry, carrying a faint metallic smell. The interior walls were hewn directly from the stone, smooth in places, rough in others, with veins of quartz glimmering faintly in the dim light. A narrow passage led to a main chamber where a single wooden table stood under a skylight, carved through meters of rock. Dust floated in the beam of gray light, spinning lazily like tiny stars. He walked slowly through each room. The layout was simple. A kitchen of sorts, a small sleeping alcove, a storage area, and deeper still, a corridor that disappeared into shadow. Old electrical cables ran along the ceiling, their ends coiled like veins cut open. Someone had once planned to bring power here, but the wires looked as though they'd been severed deliberately. He traced one cable to a metal box fixed in the wall, its cover stamped with faded letters. Property of Mountain Division. Access restricted. He brushed the dust away and frowned. Mountain Division. He'd heard of that somewhere in passing, maybe during his geological surveys in the 70s. A secretive branch of federal research, something to do with subterranean mapping during the Cold War. He told himself it was probably coincidence. Scout sniffed the air and padded ahead. She stopped at the corridor's mouth, her fur standing up along her back. A low growl rumbled in her throat. Richard watched her carefully. "Easy, girl," he murmured, but she didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on the darkness beyond the corridor, her body taut. After a moment, she backed away and sat by his leg. He reached down to scratch her behind the ear. "It's just rock," he said softly, though the words felt strangely unconvincing. That first night, he unpacked the few belongings he had brought: a lantern, a field stove, a battered notebook, a photograph of his late wife, and a tin box of geological samples he'd collected over the years. He made coffee over the small flame and sat near the open doorway that looked out toward the lake. The water was perfectly still, the surface reflecting the faint glow of the rising moon. There was no wind, no sound of insects, not even the distant hoot of an owl. It was a silence so total that his heartbeat seemed intrusive. He wrote his first entry in the notebook that night. Arrived at Lake Merrill. The house is unlike anything I've seen, half dwelling, half tomb. Feels alive in a way stone shouldn't. Maybe it's just the quiet. Maybe I've forgotten what quiet sounds like. The following days passed in slow rhythm. Morning mist drifted over the water like smoke. He repaired a few broken steps outside, set up a fishing line near the shore, and cleaned dust from the rooms. Every task felt deliberate, grounding. Yet each evening, when the sun slipped behind the ridge and the lake turned black, that same low vibration began again, faint at first, like the hum of distant machinery, then deeper, resonating through the soles of his boots. He told himself it was groundwater moving through the rock, the echo of underground streams, nothing more. But it was always strongest near that sealed metal door in the basement. Scout seemed to sense it too. One night, she began scratching the stone floor beside the door, whining softly. When Richard tried to pull her away, she resisted, ears flat, tail low. The vibration pulsed once, almost like a heartbeat. He placed his hand on the wall, and the faint tremor traveled up his arm. It felt warm. He stepped back quickly. Scout barked once, sharp and warning, then retreated behind him. The next morning, he examined the door again in daylight. It was thick, industrial, its hinges fused with rust. Someone had painted over the original markings, but faint outlines of letters remained, R. Lab 2, beneath the emblem of the Mountain Division. Richard leaned closer. The metal emitted a low tone when he pressed his ear against it, a kind of humming resonance that matched the sound he heard at night. He considered breaking it open, but decided against it. Curiosity was a dangerous instinct in a place like this. Days turned into weeks. The quiet that had first soothed him now began to feel heavier, as if the mountain itself were listening. He noticed strange details he had missed before. Tiny vents carved high in the ceiling, a faint scent of ozone in the mornings, a cold draft that moved through the house even when every window was closed. Sometimes, while writing in his journal, he would look up and realize he'd been staring at the same line for minutes, his thoughts gone somewhere else entirely. Down, into the stone, following the hum. In his entries, he began noting patterns. The vibration occurred at the same time each night, around 11:47. The lake's surface shimmered faintly with a bluish glow for about 10 minutes before returning to darkness. He began to suspect a geothermal vent under the water or some kind of phosphorescent algae. The logical explanations comforted him, though they never quite convinced him. One evening, as he sat near the shore with Scout at his side, he heard what sounded like a whisper. It was so soft he might have mistaken it for wind, except there was no wind. The voice seemed to come from the rock itself, rising and fading like the murmur of a tide. Scout lifted her head and growled. Richard spoke aloud, almost to reassure himself. Echo. Just an echo. But the whisper came again, drawn out, low, almost human. It wasn't words, more like the rhythm of breathing. He moved back inside, lit a lantern, and closed the heavy door. Yet even then, he couldn't shake the sense of being watched. The light flickered against the stone walls, and for a moment the reflections looked like movement shadows where there should have been none. He told himself it was fatigue. 50 years of noise had left his mind uneasy in silence. That night, he dreamed of tunnels winding endlessly downward, the sound of dripping water echoing through corridors that never ended. When he awoke, Scout was gone. The blanket where she slept was empty, her food untouched. Panic hit him harder than he expected. He searched the rooms, calling her name, his voice echoing sharply. Then he heard it, faint barking, distant, muffled. It came from outside, somewhere below the cliff. He grabbed his flashlight and ran. The morning fog still clung to the ground as he circled the edge of the rock face. Behind a curtain of vines and fallen branches, he found a narrow opening in the stone. A passage he hadn't noticed before. The barking came from within. "Scout!" he called, crouching down to look inside. The tunnel smelled of earth and iron, and cold air breathed out of it like the exhale of something sleeping. He hesitated, shining his light into the darkness. The beam caught the glint of metal rails running along the ground old mining tracks. His heart began to race. He crouched lower, hearing the echo of Scout's paws somewhere ahead. The tunnel curved sharply, vanishing into blackness. For a moment, he thought of turning back, but the sound of her bark, sharp, frightened, pushed him forward. He ducked inside. The air grew colder with each step. Moisture dripped from the ceiling in slow, rhythmic taps. The beam of his flashlight wavered over rusted support beams and collapsed timber. Then, suddenly, the tunnel widened into a chamber carved from solid rock. Scout stood there, tail stiff, facing a massive metal door set into the far wall. Above it, the faded words were barely legible. Mountain Division Research Facility. Richard stared, his breath visible in the dim light. This was no abandoned mine. The door loomed before him like the sealed mouth of the earth itself. He felt the vibration again, stronger now, unmistakable. It pulsed from behind that door. Scout whined softly. He reached out, laid his palm against the cold metal, and in that moment, the humming grew louder, as if the mountain were answering his touch. He stepped back, heart pounding. For years he had studied the behavior of stone, the way it fractured under pressure, how it carried sound through its body. But this was something else. It wasn't sound traveling through rock. It was the rock itself speaking. Behind him, Scout barked once, sharp and warning. A faint, hollow thud echoed from the other side of the door, like something moving deep within. Richard turned off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed him whole. For a long time he stood there, listening to the pulse of the mountain, to the rhythm of a world that had been buried for decades. He thought of the strange markings in the house, of the humming walls, of the nights when the lake had glowed like liquid glass. It was all connected. He called softly to the dog, his voice barely above a whisper. "Come on, girl. Let's go home." They stepped back into the narrow tunnel, the darkness closing behind them like a slow exhale. When they emerged into the daylight, the fog was lifting from the lake. The water looked calm again, perfectly still, as if nothing had ever stirred beneath its surface. Richard stood there for a long time, staring at the reflection of the cliffs, his heartbeat slowly matching the rhythm of the silent world around him. For now, he told himself, he would leave the door alone. But deep down, he already knew that the silence he had sought here was not silence at all. It was waiting, and sooner or later, it would call him back. For the next 2 days, Richard tried to pretend that nothing had happened. He went about his routine, as though the discovery of the underground door had been some strange dream brought on by isolation and exhaustion. He fished at dawn, repaired a section of the wooden dock, even cleaned the rust off the old lanterns that hung by the entrance. Yet no matter what he did, his thoughts kept returning to that hidden tunnel and to the way the air had seemed to breathe around him inside it. The memory of the sound, the deep, slow pulse rising from behind the metal door, clung to him like the taste of metal on his tongue. Scout was restless. She slept near the house entrance now, refusing to go down into the lower corridor. Her ears pricked at every faint vibration that passed through the floor. Each evening, when the mountain began its quiet humming again, she lifted her head and let out a low growl, as if warning her master not to listen too closely. But Richard could not help himself. The sound fascinated him. He had spent decades studying how the earth spoke through cracks, through shifts of pressure, through the quiet rumble of tectonic plates, and now he heard that same hidden language, not from nature's slow processes, but from something deliberate, rhythmic, alive. He held off returning to the tunnel for several days, telling himself he needed more light, better tools, a second battery for the flashlight. In truth, he was afraid. Yet curiosity gnawed at him until, one overcast morning, he packed his gear and descended the narrow path that led behind the vines again. Scout followed reluctantly, stopping every few yards to sniff the air, tail stiff. Inside, the tunnel was as he remembered it, rails buried under damp soil, beams of corroded steel, the faint smell of oil and time. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, deliberate intervals, like the ticking of an underground clock. As he moved deeper, the light from the entrance dimmed until only the cone of his flashlight remained, cutting a pale path through the darkness. When he reached the large chamber, he paused. The door was still there, looming in the beam of light like the sealed gate of a shipwreck. He touched its surface. It was cold, almost painfully so. His fingers traced the raised letters. Mountain Division Research Facility. Beneath them, smaller print, nearly erased by rust, read, Restricted Area. Authorized personnel only. Richard's hand lingered on the metal for a moment before he noticed something new. Near the bottom of the frame, where he remembered only smooth rock before, a section of the wall looked disturbed. The dust had been brushed away recently, and faint footprints, barely visible, marked the ground. Someone had been here. He knelt, feeling the edges of the print with his fingers. The impressions were shallow but distinct. Boots, not animal tracks. He followed them for a few steps. They led away from the door toward a smaller passage half hidden behind fallen debris. He hesitated, then pushed aside a loose beam and squeezed through. The passage opened into a narrow corridor supported by steel ribs that curved like the bones of a whale. At its end stood another door, lighter than the first, slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The beam of his flashlight revealed rows of tables covered in sheets of dust. On them lay broken glass instruments, microscopes, and papers yellowed with age. A cracked chalkboard still bore half-erased formulas. The place smelled of rust, old paper, and something faintly chemical, like long-dried antiseptic. His light swept across a series of lockers built into the far wall. One stood open, containing a set of moldy coveralls with a faded badge that read, Dr. M. Keene. Inside the locker's top shelf lay a small box, metal and heavy. Richard opened it carefully. Within were several notebooks, their covers embossed with the same emblem he had seen outside, the Mountain Division's insignia, a triangle with 3 lightning bolts cutting through it. He opened the first notebook. The handwriting was neat, precise. The ink faded to brown. July 3rd, 1953. Initial survey complete. The anomaly lies directly beneath the lake. Sample emits electromagnetic interference inconsistent with known materials. Dr. Keene has named it Deep Light. He read on. The entries spoke of a crystalline substance extracted from a fissure under the mountain, a mineral that emitted a faint blue luminescence and reacted to electrical currents. As the research progressed, the tone of the notes changed. We have recorded pulses that align with human brainwave patterns. Another line. The mineral response to emotional states anger increases its resonance. When left undisturbed, it hums softly, almost like breathing. Richard closed the book slowly. His pulse quickened as he realized that what he had been hearing every night was not the movement of water or the shifting of stone. It was the same sound described in the notes, continuing decades after the project had supposedly ended. He placed the notebooks carefully back into the box and looked around the room again. Near one of the tables stood a control panel with a cracked glass cover. Several of the gauges still held their needles mid-scale, as though time itself had paused here. Beneath a layer of grime, he could make out a switch labeled Auxiliary Power. Without thinking, he reached for it and flipped it upward. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a low electrical hum filled the air. Light flickered across the ceiling as old bulbs strained to life, glowing a sickly yellow. The laboratory, dormant for half a century, shuddered awake. Screens blinked, and a monitor on the far wall lit up with static. Words formed slowly on the screen. System restore. Stand by. Richard's heart pounded. He stepped closer as the static cleared, revealing a timestamp. 3 days ago. On the screen, grainy black and white footage showed the same corridor he had entered moments before. A figure moved through it, tall, wearing a coat, holding a flashlight. The image was distorted, the face unrecognizable. The figure turned toward the camera for a moment before the feed cut to black. The timestamp blinked again, then froze. Richard backed away, every instinct in him screaming that he was not alone in this place. He turned toward the door, listening. Only silence answered. Scout whined softly at his feet, tail tucked, her body trembling. He moved through the lab quickly, searching for another exit, and found a stairway descending into a lower level. The air grew colder as he descended, each breath forming small clouds. The stairs ended at another corridor, this one lined with heavy glass panels. Behind them stood rows of strange equipment. Cylindrical containers connected by thick cables, rusted machines with warning signs, radiation, high voltage, experimental material. He approached one of the panels. Inside, a faint glow pulsed from a metal pod connected to the wall by a series of tubes. On its side, barely legible, was written, Sample Chamber. Subject Alpha. Beneath it, another note scratched into the glass. Do not reactivate. He turned off his flashlight, letting the dim blue light from the pod fill the corridor. The glow brightened, then dimmed, almost in rhythm with his own heartbeat. It reminded him of the light he'd seen reflected on the lake some nights, the same slow pulse beneath the surface. A sudden static crackle burst from a nearby intercom speaker, making him jump. Then, faintly, a voice began to play, a man's voice, weary, fragmented by age and distortion. If anyone hears this, you must not activate the containment system. It listens. It remembers. The stone itself. It's not dead matter. The message ended abruptly with a click. Richard stared at the speaker, frozen. The name tag on the lab coat in the open locker upstairs returned to his mind. Dr. M. Keene. The voice had to be his. The air seemed to thicken. He felt the faint tremor under his boots again, stronger than before, spreading through the floor in slow waves. Scout barked sharply, the sound echoing off the walls. One of the lights overhead flickered, then another. A deep, metallic groan reverberated through the corridor, as if the entire mountain were shifting in its sleep. He ran back toward the stairs, pulling the dog with him. The hum followed, growing louder, almost melodic now. A vibration that seemed to form patterns, tones that brushed the edge of understanding. It wasn't just sound anymore. It felt like thought pressing against his own. Back in the main chamber, he shut off the generator switch. The lights died instantly, plunging everything into darkness. Only the faint phosphorescent glow from the pod below remained, pulsing in the distance like a heartbeat in the dark. Richard's mind raced. What if the researchers hadn't merely studied the crystal? What if they had awakened something in it, something that persisted, conscious and unfinished? He gathered the notebooks and hurried toward the tunnel leading back to the surface. As he walked, he felt the walls vibrating softly under his fingertips, the rock alive with a low, resonant energy. It reminded him of standing too close to a turbine power contained, waiting. When he finally stepped out into the daylight, he could barely breathe. The lake stretched before him, still and calm, yet its color seemed subtly changed, a deeper hue of blue that caught the morning light like glass. Scout pressed close to his leg, whining. He sat down on a rock, the box of notebooks beside him, and tried to steady his thoughts. The rational part of him wanted to catalog everything, to explain it as geological anomaly or residual radiation. But another part, a quieter, older instinct, knew that what he had found below was not meant for explanation. That night he dreamed again. He saw the mountain from above, its veins of quartz glowing faintly beneath the surface like rivers of light. He felt himself descending through the stone, past layers of time, until he reached a vast hollow chamber where a single crystal formation pulsed like a living organ. From within it came whispers, hundreds of voices merging into one. When he awoke, the sound was still in his ears. He went to the entrance of the tunnel at dawn. The vines hung motionless, the air cold and damp. He wanted to seal it, to forget it existed. Yet even as he stood there, the ground beneath him vibrated once, softly, almost like a sigh. The mountain was awake. He turned toward the lake, where the water's surface shimmered faintly under the first light of day. Somewhere below that stillness, he knew, lay the same pulse, the same intelligence that had watched the scientists, that now watched him. Richard whispered to the empty air, as though to reassure himself, "It's just stone." But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't true. The stone had listened, and now it was beginning to answer. For a long time after his second descent into the mountain, Richard avoided looking at the water. The surface of the lake, once a mirror of calm, had changed imperceptibly. Its stillness now seemed watchful. The faint blue gleam that sometimes surfaced at night, no longer beautiful but purposeful, as if it were the flicker of an unseen eye beneath the depths. Scout would not go near it. She stayed close to the house, pacing restlessly whenever the hum began again from within the stone. Richard tried to busy himself with simple things, replacing the lock on the shed, mending the fishing line, chopping wood, but no task held his attention for long. His mind was always turning back to the notebooks, to the words of Dr. Keene that seemed less like scientific observation and more like confession. At night, he read by lamplight, the pages brittle, the ink faded. Energy output rising beyond containment. Crystalline structure exhibits behavior similar to neural activity. It mirrors stimuli, adapts, remembers. Another entry, later. Keene insists it's consciousness. I refuse to call it that. Yet the pattern of resonance matches the alpha frequency of the human brain. When we leave the chamber, it continues humming our rhythm. Richard had read enough technical reports in his career to know when data had crossed into fear. The final entry was short, written in a trembling hand. Containment breach imminent. The mountain breathes. It wants to wake. He closed the notebook, his hand shaking. That night, the hum was louder than ever, pulsing through the walls of the stone house like a heartbeat. Scout whined softly, her ears flattened. When Richard touched the wall, he felt a faint warmth, as though blood ran through the rock itself. He whispered to calm the dog, but his own voice sounded hollow in the cavernous quiet. Just past midnight, the air shifted. A deep vibration rose from below, the same tone that had haunted him for weeks, but now it swelled until the cups on the table rattled. The light in the lamp dimmed, then flared blue. Outside, a soft ripple crossed the lake's surface, spreading outward like breath on glass. For a moment, Richard thought he heard a voice buried within the sound. Not words, not language, but a human cadence, pleading or calling. Then it faded. He sat motionless until dawn, unable to sleep, unable even to think clearly. By morning, the vibration had ceased, but something in the atmosphere had changed. The air felt charged, metallic. He walked to the edge of the water. The reflection of the cliffs shimmered faintly in shades of blue and silver. There was no wind, yet concentric rings moved across the surface, radiating from a point near the center of the lake. He followed them with his eyes until he saw the faintest outline of something rising beneath the shape of stone, or perhaps metal, too symmetrical to be natural. Without realizing it, he had begun to whisper the words from the notebook aloud. It mirrors stimuli, adapts, remembers. The phrases felt like echoes, fragments of someone else's thought lodged in his mind. He turned away sharply. The rational part of him demanded explanation. Seismic movement, thermal currents, some leftover power source reactivating underground. But in the stillness of that morning, reason felt small. He knew he couldn't ignore it. If the old research facility was active again, even partially, the system might be unstable. If the energy described in those reports was leaking into the lake, it could be dangerous, not just to him, but to everything around. The thought of the valley, of the forest that surrounded it, of the quiet life that had briefly felt possible, pushed him to act. By evening he had gathered his flashlight, crowbar, and the old notebook. Scout followed reluctantly as he returned once more to the tunnel. The air inside the mountain was colder than before, sharp with the scent of ozone. The narrow rails gleamed faintly, as though brushed clean by invisible hands. His footsteps echoed with unnatural clarity. When he reached the first chamber, he found that the generator panel he had shut down days ago was glowing faintly, the switch in the on position. He froze. He hadn't touched it. The hum that filled the air now was not the slow pulse he'd grown used to. It was layered, complex, rising and falling, like breathing turned to song. Scout barked once and pressed close to his leg. Richard forced himself forward. The laboratory looked changed. Dust no longer blanketed the tables. The air was moving, stirred by unseen currents. On the monitor, a line of text flickered in the darkness. Containment breach. Level 1 lockdown. He stared, remembering the last words of the recording he had heard from the intercom. It listens. It remembers. From somewhere deep within the lower corridors came a sound like metal cracking, followed by a rush of air. He ran toward the noise, descending the stairwell to the chamber, where the crystalline pod had once glowed. The door to that corridor stood open now. Inside, the blue light had grown blinding, flooding the space with a pulsing radiance that threw long shadows across the walls. The pod itself was shattered. The glass melted inward, as if something had burned through it from within. Richard shielded his eyes. Through the glare, he saw movement-shifting forms within the light, the outlines of faces that dissolved and reappeared, each vanishing into another. He took a step back, tripping over a fallen beam. Scout barked furiously at the light, teeth bared, but then whimpered and shrank away. The hum reached a pitch that vibrated in his bones, then suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deeper than any he had ever known. In that silence, a voice spoke. It was not external. It bloomed inside his mind, soft and measured. You opened the door. The words were neither male nor female, neither human nor alien, but carried the tone of memory itself. He staggered back, clutching his head. "Who's there?" he shouted, though no sound left his throat. The voice came again, layered, echoing his own fear. "We remember." He turned and fled up the stairs, the dog close behind. The floor trembled. As he reached the upper level, he heard the walls groan, metal tearing against stone. Dust rained from the ceiling. He burst through the entrance tunnel and into the pale light of evening. Behind him, a rumble rose like thunder. The mountain exhaled. A cloud of dust and mist erupted from the cave mouth. He stumbled to the shore of the lake, gasping for air. When he looked back, the entire cliff face seemed to shimmer. Lines of blue light traced the cracks in the stone like veins. The water of the lake began to churn, turning the once still surface into a whirlpool that glowed from below. Scout barked wildly, circling him, desperate to pull him away. Yet he couldn't look away. The patterns in the water were symmetrical, deliberate-like. The neural maps he had seen in the laboratory journals, only vast, planetary. It was then he understood. The researchers hadn't found the crystal. They had awakened the mountain itself. The mineral, the energy, the humming resonance. It was all part of a single organism, ancient and buried, stretching beneath the entire valley. The facility had been built not to study it, but to contain it. And now, because he had reactivated the systems, it was awake again. A wave of heat rolled across the shore as the lake erupted in light. For a moment, Richard saw shapes moving beneath the surface, fluid and translucent, like currents given form. He thought of Keene's note-it mirror stimuli. If it truly mirrored consciousness, then it was now mirroring his terror. The glow shifted violently, flashing brighter, pulsing with the rhythm of his racing heart. He knew then what he had to do. The generator, the emergency purge system mentioned in the notebooks, might still exist somewhere within the lab. If he could trigger it, perhaps he could collapse the tunnels and seal whatever lay beneath. It was madness to go back in, but madness had already come out. He turned to Scout. The dog's eyes met his, understanding flickering there. "Stay here," he whispered. "If I'm not back, run." She whined and pawed at his leg, but he pulled away and ran toward the tunnel, covering his face from the stinging dust. The entrance was half collapsed, but he squeezed through. Inside, the light from below illuminated the passage like the interior of some living organism. The air hummed with energy, each vibration a heartbeat. He moved quickly, down through the corridors that now pulsed with blue veins. The lab was nearly unrecognizable. Machines flickering to life, papers swirling in the wind of unseen currents. He found the main control panel. A row of switches glowed faint red. Among them was one labeled in stenciled paint, Purge. The key was still inserted, frozen by corrosion. He grabbed a wrench from the table and forced it. Metal screamed, then turned. The switch clicked into position. Alarms blared, a mechanical voice repeating through the chamber. "Evacuation required. Purge, sequence, initiated." The hum became a roar. The walls shook, cracks raced across the ceiling, spilling debris. He turned and ran. The light behind him swelled, consuming everything. He could feel the heat even as he reached the upper tunnel. When he burst out into the open air, the ground trembled violently. A column of light erupted from the center of the lake, rising straight into the gray sky, before collapsing inward with a soundless implosion. The mountain groaned, the cliff split, and then there was only falling rock and a rush of steam. When the noise faded, the lake was gone. In its place lay a vast hollow basin of dark stone, still smoking. The air smelled of iron and rain. Richard collapsed to his knees, coughing, searching for Scout. A moment later, she appeared from behind a rock, covered in dust, but alive. She ran to him and pressed her head against his chest. He held her tightly, trembling with exhaustion and disbelief. Night fell slowly over the ruined valley. A faint mist rose from the basin where the lake had been, glowing faintly with the same soft blue as before, though weaker now, fading. Richard watched until the glow disappeared entirely. Only the stars reflected faintly in the black hollow remained. Weeks passed. The government did not come. No one knew or cared about the old facility or the man who had triggered its final collapse. Richard built a small shelter near the edge of the basin. The house beneath the cliff was gone, buried with the tunnels. He lived quietly, fishing from the new stream that cut through the valley, writing in his journal at night. The silence had returned, but it was no longer the same. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the mountains, he heard a low hum beneath the surface of the earth, faint as memory. Scout would lift her head, ears twitching, then settle again beside him. He had stopped trying to explain it. The hum was neither threat nor comfort. It was simply part of the world now, as inevitable as the heartbeat within his own chest. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, he took out his last surviving notebook and wrote the final words he would ever add to it. We search for silence, believing it is peace. But silence is never empty. It is the sound of something waiting to be heard. He closed the book and stared at the basin, where the first stars began to appear. The wind moved gently across the stones, carrying a whisper that might have been his imagination or the mountain breathing once more. Scout rested her head on his knee. Together they watched the darkness settle, and the world, for the first time in a long time, seemed perfectly still. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next story waiting for you right now. There are so many more worlds to discover. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.